Our brains have an absolutely remarkable ability to adapt after and recover themselves after injury. However, unless your stroke survivor understands what the word neuroplasticity actually is and how it happens and how it exists, then after their stroke, they will be reducing their powers to rehabilitate at home during that important recovery process. So, caregivers, by assisting your stroke survivor to understand what neuroplasticity is and explaining to them that it exists, you will empower them in their recovery in their own homes. Hi there, I'm Dr. Kenneth Monaghan. I'm a neuroplasticity expert and I'm a neurology rehabilitation specialist. And I have an absolute passion for trying to make a stroke survivor's home the best place for their physical rehabilitation. So, neuroplasticity is a little bit like your brain's superpower. It's that amazing ability that your brain has to adapt and change and, in response to everything that you experience in life. So when you've had your stroke and it affects certain parts of your brain doesn't just give up. Instead, it starts to rewire itself. It starts to redevelop itself in a certain way. And this is what neuroplasticity is. Your brain is trying to find new ways to do things, like trying to move your hand or trying to help you to speak differently and properly, or trying to take steps or trying to balance. And neuroplasticity is describing that process that happens within your brain cells, where the brain cells, of which we call neurons, they change their structure in two ways. They either adapt and change by developing more connections to the other nerve cells within the brain, or the individual neurons, they change by thickening and making themselves, stronger so that messages can go through them a little bit faster in response to all the experiences in your life. And these experiences can be physical experiences that you actually get involved in, or they can also be mental or visual experiences where you're thinking about something. Both have the ability to help your brain to create new pathways. So oftentimes people think of neuroplasticity as, your brain being like a road that has different pathways. And if one pathway gets blocked, for example, then the brain tries to find a detour, or it tries to reroute itself to try and get around that blockage. And this is a little bit like what happens in the brain. So in response to everything you're doing, the brain creates new connections between the nerve cells, and that's essentially neuroplasticity in action. A very good example from my own life is if you've ever tried to learn a new musical instrument, so like the piano or the guitar, and about 20 or 30 years ago, I remember when I started learning the guitar myself. And when I started off, I had to, watch my fingers as they very, very slowly placed themselves onto the guitar strings. And then I strummed and it sounded awful. And I took my fingers off and I had to watch again. And I did that over and over again. But what was happening was that every time that I placed my fingers on the strings, I was noticing that I was getting that split second faster, and I was starting to do it automatically by the time that I had practiced it over and over and over and over. And essentially, that was my brain learning a new pattern, and that was essentially neuroplasticity in action. And our brains want us to learn patterns because when our brains learn automatic patterns, it saves us energy. And that's the reason that every person generally learns patterns, and why people feel so comfortable in their own homes, because we know everything there and we can go and we can be involved in the patterns that saves us energy and stops us being extra tired. So neuroplasticity is that creation of the brain creating new pathways. And it's very exciting, and it's awfully important for your stroke survivor to understand this, Because if they do, then it has to give them hope and extra motivation to know that the power is there, the ability of your brain to change itself in response to all the practice that you do is possible. So try not to be so frustrated. There's a lot of challenges that are facing you as a stroke survivor, but remember that your brain is working extremely hard behind the scenes to try and get better. And of course, that's where therapy and practice come in, because if you repetitively practice those little movements or steps or balance, then new connections will be created, and your abilities, your physical ability to balance and walk and to move your joints and to, lift things against in a stronger way will improve. It's like teaching your brain new tricks, and it will certainly learn with experience and with practice. Your brain is always learning. Your brain is always trying to figure things out. And this gives you hope and gives you possibilities for recovery. And remember that rewiring or making new patterns in your brain, this is the goal of stroke rehabilitation, so that you can move your limbs and you can balance yourself better. You can take those steps again. Another common way to think of neuroplasticity is to think of your brain as a power grid where billions of pathways or roads are lighting up every time that you think of something, or you feel emotions, or where you maybe feel physically, do something physically or do something, some action or activity. And some of these pathways or the roads or the patterns or the activities that take place every day means that those power grids are being used often and they're well traveled. And those pathways or those roads, they are the established pathways in your brains, and they represent our habits. They're our established way of thinking. And this can be conscious, it can be unconscious. It can be our feelings in response to circumstances, or, the events that are going on around us and what we're doing in response to that. And every time we think in a certain way, or we practice a certain task, or we feel a specific emotion, then what's happening is that we're strengthening these pathways or these roads. And when we think about something that has not been done before, what happens is we set or we lay down the blueprint for that new action for the first time. But to strengthen that, we need to think or follow up with either a visualization or a mental practice if we're not physically able to move a limb, or an actual voluntary taking part in the action if we actually are able to voluntarily move a limb or create an activity in our bodies. And of course, this is where the whole notion of repetitive practice and repetitive movements is so important. Or if we're not able to actually physically move our fingers or our hands or our limbs, then repetitive visualization of intended movements, it has its benefits. So when we think about something differently, or learn a new task, or simply choose a different emotion, we start carving out those new roads, those new pathways in our brains. And if we keep traveling those new pathways, if we keep practicing those new activities, those movements, those steps, the balance, then our brains and those pathways start to strengthen. And we start not only strengthening the new pathways, but the old pathways that are getting used less, they start to weaken in response to not being used. And the process of rewiring your brain by forming these new connections and weakening the old ones is very much neuroplasticity in action. And what's the brilliant news here? The brilliant news is that we all, including your stroke survivor, including you as a caregiver, we all have the ability to learn and change and rewire our brains. So if you've ever changed a bad habit or you've thought about something differently, then essentially what you've done is you've carved out a new pathway in your brain, and you have experienced neuroplasticity in action firsthand. So with repeated and directed attention towards your desired changes, you can rewire your brain. And this is essential as a caregiver, that you explain this to your stroke survivor, because If they've just come home, been discharged from their inpatient setting, and they're feeling vulnerable and they're feeling like a recovery may not be possible, then you have to explain to them that neuroplasticity is possible at any stage, any time after a stroke has happened. So everything we experience every day of our lives, every moment of our lives, essentially changes our brains. And knowing this gives us hope and gives us something to look forward to. So thank you very much for listening. If you found the video useful, then please don't be afraid to send me a comment or a message. And if you do want to learn more, then please look up my website, which is lightsmirrorsaction.com. And you'll see plenty of more resources, workbooks, extra videos that you can use that can help you to make your home the best place for your recovery. My next video is going to explain the power of belief. And this information will, again, no more than neuroplasticity, it will be hugely beneficial and essential for your stroke survivor to give themselves the best chance of a stroke recovery. Thank you very, very much for listening again.